My name is Rebecca Miller, and telling my story is not easy. Even after being away from the community for years, I still feel the weight of the rules I carried since birth. But today I choose to break the silence. Not because I want revenge, but because I believe that the truth can save lives. For a long time I thought my life was exactly as it should be. I believed that being born a woman in the Amish community was a gift, a blessing. Until I realized it was a prison. I was born in a small community in rural Ohio, where time seemed to have stopped. There was no electricity, no cars, or anything resembling the modern world. Horses and buggies were our only means of transportation, and the Bible was the only book allowed. For as long as I can remember, I recall those cold mornings when my sisters and I were already up before the sun, preparing breakfast, cleaning the floors, helping our mother sew and take care of the younger ones. Boys went to the fields, girls stayed indoors learning to serve. Everything seemed normal to me until the day I asked a question. I was only 5 years old. We were heading to worship service and I innocently asked my mother, "Mommy, why do we have to cover our hair but Daddy doesn't?" She stopped walking. Her eyes filled with a fear I couldn't understand. She squeezed my hand tightly, bent down, and spoke almost without moving her lips. "Never ask that kind of question again, Rebecca. Never." I didn't understand why, but I learned something important that day. Asking questions was not allowed. In the community, girls were raised to obey, stay silent, and accept. We wore plain dresses, always the same color, without lace or decoration. Looking in the mirror for too long was forbidden. They said vanity was a sin. Our long hair was always tied up beneath the cap, the white veil that symbolized submission. The outside world did not exist for us. I had never seen a television, never spoken on the phone, never read a book outside the Bible. At the age of 7, I witnessed something that marked me forever. My friend Anna was joyful, dreamy, and far too curious. One day she was seen pretending to be a teacher with the younger children, teaching letters on the dirt floor. That was considered arrogance and rebellion. I remember the day they came for her. 2 elders knocked on her door and took her away. They said she was being sent for correction in another community. We never saw her again. Her mother wept silently, her father stared at the ground. And we, the children, learned the lesson. Those who think differently disappear. At the community school we learned only the basics. Math for household budgeting, reading to interpret scripture, writing only for recipes and Bible verses. Nothing beyond that. History, science, or any questions about the world were considered dangerous. Women didn't need to know more than what was necessary to run a household and obey their husbands. Growing up there meant learning to swallow tears, silence your thoughts, and suffocate your dreams. At 10 years old, I began to notice the harsh reality faced by the older girls. At every church service, there were whispers about who would be the next to be promised. Girls of 14, 15 years old were given to men often twice their age. I remember a cold Sunday when my cousin Ruth was called to the front of the congregation. Her marriage to an elder's brother had been arranged. She showed no reaction. She just lowered her head. The next day she cried so much that her mother locked her in the room so no one would hear. A month later she was married. When I saw her at the ceremony, her eyes looked empty. I also learned early on what happened to those who tried to escape. Ruth tried. One night, while everyone was asleep, she slipped out through the back door, but she didn't get far. The elders brought her back and the punishment was cruel. She spent weeks isolated in a barn without contact with anyone. When she reappeared, she was unrecognizable. She walked with her head down, spoke in whispers, and never smiled again. I looked at her and thought, she died inside. Despite everything, there were moments when a child's heart tried to find beauty. My father, though submissive to the rules, was kind when he could be. He took me for buggy rides and sometimes told Bible stories in a gentle tone. I saw goodness in him, but I also saw fear. Fear of the elders, fear of God, fear of making a mistake. My mother was an exhausted woman. Not because she lacked strength, but because living in that environment drained every last trace of hope. Still at night while sewing she would sing soft hymns. Sometimes she'd close her eyes and for a moment she looked at peace. I liked to watch her in those moments, wondering what she might be thinking about. I grew up trying not to attract attention, trying to be the perfect daughter. But something inside me was starting to stir. I didn't know what it was, didn't know where it came from. I just felt that something wasn't right. Could God really want us to live like this? Was blind obedience truly a sign of faith? I had no answers. Worse, I knew I wasn't allowed to ask. Fear was the foundation of our community. Fear kept us obedient, silent, submissive. I grew up hearing stories of girls who vanished, of families expelled for rebellion, of severe punishments for those who dared to doubt. And yet, deep down in my heart, a small voice whispered, "This isn't freedom. This isn't God." But I silenced that voice. I silenced it because I was afraid. I silenced it because in the Amish community, silence was the only protection we had left. I didn't know it yet, but that discomfort inside me was growing. And one day it would become too big to ignore. I was only 13 when I heard my name called in public for the first time. It was during a Sunday service, a day when the barn was full. Men on one side, women on the other, and children sitting up front, all in silence. Elder Jacob, with his long beard and stern expression, raised his voice and said, "Rebecca Miller will be promised in marriage to Elias Yoder." In that moment the ground disappeared beneath my feet. My heart pounded, my breath shortened, and my head began to spin. I knew what that meant. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a choice. It was an order. I had been promised, and the decision was final. Elias Yoder was 34 years old. I only knew him by sight. A large man with a deep voice and heavy hands, both respected and feared. They said he was strict with his family. I knew what that meant. He had been married before, but his wife had died 2 years earlier from childbirth complications. No one spoke much about her. I often wondered what had really happened, but I knew asking questions was dangerous. When the service ended, I walked to my mother in silence. She said nothing. She just held my hand tightly and we walked home. On the way, the women looked at me with expressions I couldn't decipher. Some with pity, others with resignation. When I got home, I went into my room and cried until I had no strength left. My younger sister, Sarah, hugged me, but even she had no words. We both knew there was nothing to be done. The next morning, my mother came into the room and sat beside me. Her eyes were red. She stroked my hair and said simply, "Accept it, daughter. God knows what He's doing." But something inside me screamed that it wasn't God doing this. It was men. Men deciding our lives, our bodies, our futures. I wanted to say that out loud. I wanted to question it, but I was afraid. Preparations for the wedding began quickly. My grandmother came to sew my dress, plain without embellishment as tradition required. The day I tried it on, I looked at myself in the small mirror in the living room and saw a girl trying to look like a woman, but unable to hide the terror in her eyes. The weeks that followed were the worst of my life. The constant fear, the ache in my stomach, the sleepless nights. I knew my childhood was over. I knew I was about to be handed over to a man who didn't know me, who didn't care about me, who only saw me as another duty to fulfill. On the wedding day, the sky was gray. The ceremony was brief. Memorized words, empty promises, and heavy stares. I felt numb, as if watching everything from outside my body. When the time came to leave with Elias, my mother hugged me for a few seconds longer and I realized she was crying. My father looked away. We arrived at Elias's house, a secluded property surrounded by fields and silence. I felt small, fragile, utterly alone. He wasn't violent at first, but his gaze made it clear. He now owned me. I walked to the room he pointed to and sat on the edge of the bed, trembling. That night, I learned the true meaning of the word submission. There was no tenderness, no patience. It was simply the fulfillment of a conjugal duty imposed on me, with no regard for my fear or my pain. I cried in silence, biting the pillow to avoid making noise. and when it was over he simply turned over and fell asleep. I lay there alone, feeling my body ache and my soul shatter. In the days that followed, I tried to be obedient. I did what I was told. I cleaned, cooked, stayed silent. But the fear wouldn't let me breathe. Every step he took toward me made my heart race. I lived under constant tension, always bracing for the next moment when he would demand what he claimed was his right. There were moments when I wanted to run. I'd look out the window and think about crossing the fields, disappearing, vanishing. But I knew what happened to those who tried. The stories were whispered among the women. Punishments, public humiliation, isolation. And worst of all, they were forced to return and continue obeying. One morning during breakfast, Elias said in a dry, emotionless tone, "You will give me children. That's what God made women for." I lowered my head and felt the urge to scream. I was just a child. I was only 14, already carrying the weight of a fate I hadn't chosen. The nights became long and unbearable. During the day I tried to keep busy to avoid thinking. At night I prayed, not rehearsed prayers but desperate whispers. "God, please, hear me. I can't take this anymore." Time passed and the feeling of imprisonment only grew stronger. I watched my life slipping through my fingers. No control, no freedom, no hope. My body belonged to someone else. My thoughts had to be silenced and my faith began to crack. But even in the deepest pit, something inside me resisted. A faint voice, almost imperceptible, whispered, "This is not what God wants for you." I clung to that whisper. It was all I had. And it was that thin thread of hope that one day would lead me to try to escape. The first weeks of marriage were a profound shock, but the worst was still to come. I thought forced submission was the extent of the pain I'd have to endure. I had no idea there was an even crueler side to our reality. The system of punishment and public humiliation used to keep us silent and broken inside. It started subtly. Small mistakes, little slips, were corrected with harsh looks and cold reprimands. If I spilled water while serving tea or forgot to bring in a piece of laundry before the rain, Elias would look at me with disgust and say, "You're my wife. You were made to serve well." Sometimes I would hear the murmured line, "God doesn't like lazy women." But greater mistakes, what the elders deemed disobedience or insubordination, were punished with something I will never forget. I remember one morning during breakfast, Elias complained that the bread was slightly burnt. I tried to explain that the wood had been damp and the fire was hard to control. He paused, slowly stood from his chair, and looked at me as if I had committed a mortal sin. "You dare to answer me back?" he said in a low, dangerous voice. Before I could say anything, he grabbed my hand and dragged me outside. He took me to the barn, where other men and some women were gathered for a community work meeting. There he forced me to kneel on the cold ground and called for Elder Jacob. "My wife needs to learn humility," he said as if talking about an animal. Elder Jacob looked at me with that harsh expression I'll never forget. "Rebecca, you failed to serve. You failed to be submissive. You must learn to be obedient and silent as God commands." And then came the punishment. I was forced to remain on my knees in the freezing cold, with my hands raised to the sky. Every time my arms trembled or lowered, Elias poked me with a stick. I stayed that way for hours. When my strength gave out, I collapsed to the ground. They simply said, "Get up and ask for forgiveness." With tears in my eyes, shaking from the cold and pain, I had to look at everyone and say, "Forgive me, community. Forgive me, my husband. Forgive me, God, for being weak and failing." The shame was unbearable. I felt like an object, a lifeless weight. On the way home, Elias didn't say a word. But once we arrived, he looked at me and said coldly, "That was for your own good." That night I cried alone. My body hurt, but the deeper pain was in my soul. For the first time I felt anger. Anger at myself for allowing it. Anger at him for treating me as less than human. And anger at God. Or rather, at the distorted image of God they had taught me to fear. The following week, I heard about a young woman named Miriam who had been publicly punished for rebellion. She had refused to cut her hair in the way required by the elders. Her punishment was cruel. Her head was completely shaved and she was made to sit in the middle of the community square during the worship service, so everyone could see and learn the lesson. Her gaze, empty, lost, shattered. It left a deep mark on me. Public humiliation was a powerful tool to keep women under control. Often, the women themselves became watchdogs over one another. I was reported once by a neighbor for smiling while working in the field, something she claimed was a sign of vanity. The result? 3 days without being allowed to leave the house or approach the gate. Gradually, I learned that, inside the community, being a woman meant being invisible. We weren't allowed to have our own will, to make mistakes, to show pain or fatigue. And when we did, we were put on display as living examples of failure and shame. The worst episode one experienced happened a few months later. During a service, while Elias was talking to another man, I, exhausted and distracted, took a few seconds too long to stand when the signal for prayer was given. That was seen as disrespect. At the end of the service, I was called to the front by Jacob. "Rebecca Miller, kneel down," he ordered. In front of everyone, I had to ask for forgiveness publicly once again, tears streaming down my face. When I finished, he placed his heavy hand on my head and said, "May the weight of obedience never leave your shoulders." I returned home that day feeling like I no longer had a soul. I was just a body breathing out of obligation. And yet, deep in my heart, something still burned. A persistent voice told me that this could not be God's will. That the Creator of the universe did not want to see his daughters humiliated, crushed, erased. I began to pray differently. No more memorized prayers. I spoke to God in secret, in hushed whispers under the covers. "Lord, if you really see me, if you truly love me, get me out of here. Show me there's something beyond this hell." I didn't know it yet, but that prayer would begin to be answered in ways I could never have imagined. I didn't know what true fear was until the day I found out I was pregnant. I was only 15. My body was still fragile, my mind full of doubts, and my heart a tight knot of anxiety and insecurity. When I realized my period was late, I felt more terror than joy. I should have been happy. After all, in the Amish community, motherhood was the supreme mission of a woman. But I was terrified. I told Elias with a trembling voice. He simply nodded, showing no emotion. "It was expected," he said. "Take care of yourself. The next child will come soon after." The coldness in his words hit me like a knife. I wasn't a wife. I was a womb. A tool. Months passed and my body began to change. The back pain, constant nausea, the feeling of weakness. All of it was seen as part of the natural process. There were no doctors, no tests, no ultrasounds. The community viewed modern medicine as human interference in God's will. Birth had to happen at home, assisted only by older women, without medication, without anesthesia, without preparation. My mother tried to comfort me, but I saw the hidden fear in her eyes. She herself had lost 2 babies during childbirth and carried the silent grief of those losses. When I asked if she was afraid for me, she lowered her eyes and simply said, "God has a plan." But I began to question. What if the plan was cruel? What if the plan meant death? The final weeks were unbearable. I had light, frequent contractions, pain that kept me from sleeping, and an exhaustion that seemed to drain my soul. The women in the community came to visit and said the same rehearsed phrases, forced smiles, distant eyes. "It'll pass quickly. Be strong. God gives strength to his obedient daughters." I felt alone. Alone among so many people who seemed blind, trapped in rules that only made sense to those who didn't bear the real weight of pain. In the early hours of the morning when labor began, I woke up drenched in sweat. The pain was sharp, cutting, unlike anything I'd ever felt. Elias awoke to my groans and went to call my mother and 2 experienced women from the community. I was scared, trembling, trying to hold back the sobs so I wouldn't seem weak. They arrived and began the ritual. Clean cloths boiled in water, basins prepared, makeshift mattresses laid out on the wooden floor of the room. My body was on full alert and I could feel something wasn't right. Hours dragged on. The pain intensified. I screamed but was constantly reprimanded. Silence, Rebecca. Screaming is a sign of weakness and vanity. But how could I hold back screams when my body was being torn apart from the inside? How could I stay silent when life seemed to be pouring out of me in blood and tears? The baby wouldn't come. The pain wouldn't stop. And I started to notice the barely concealed panic on the women's faces. But none of them dared to speak. None of them even considered calling for outside help. And then, after almost 20 hours of agony, he was born. A boy. Small, fragile, silent. Why isn't he crying? I asked between tears and terror. They looked at each other and one of them took the baby in her arms, trying to revive him. Nothing. My son was dead. I screamed. A scream not only of physical pain but of despair, rage, and helplessness. Call a doctor. Please. I begged, even knowing it was useless. My mother wept. Elias said nothing. It is God's will, he said coldly. God's will? Was it really God's will that my son should die suffocated without even a chance? Or was it those absurd rules that killed my baby? I couldn't stand up for 2 days. I bled heavily, was weak, feverish. But no one called for help. They placed cold compresses, prayed beside me, and forced me to repeat that I accepted the Lord's will. On the 3rd day, when I was finally able to sit up in bed, my son had already been buried in silence, without my consent, without a goodbye. I felt empty. Empty in body, empty in soul. And more than ever I began to feel anger. Anger at the rules, anger at the community, anger at the God they preached, who seemed only to punish. I spent weeks in silence, unable to look anyone in the eye. Elias continued with his routine as if nothing had happened. He didn't hug me, didn't console me, didn't share in the pain. He just looked at me with indifference. You'll be pregnant again soon. Be strong, he said. But I didn't want it anymore. I didn't want to live under those orders. I didn't want to accept a God who seemed blind to our suffering. And that's when doubt began to grow inside me, quiet, corrosive. Was this really the true God? A God who turns his eyes away from the death of innocence, who allows women to suffer in silence, who places weight and pain on fragile shoulders without ever lifting the burden. I began to pray differently. Not for strength to accept, but for freedom. I asked for a sign. I pleaded desperately that God would show me a way. Anyway. And one cold autumn morning, while hanging clothes on the line, an elderly woman quietly approached me and handed me a small folded piece of paper. I looked at her, startled, but she just gestured for silence and walked away. When I opened the paper, I could hardly believe it. It was a letter from someone who had escaped the community. And there, for the first time, I saw a possibility. A path to freedom. I never knew such a small piece of paper could carry so much weight and so much hope at once. I remember that morning as if it were now. The cold sliced my skin as I hung clothes with frozen hands and my head down. My mind drifted between the grief of losing my baby and the unbearable emptiness in my chest. Then I felt someone near me. It was Ruth, an elderly woman from the community. She approached slowly and, without a word, slipped a folded paper into the pocket of my apron. She looked into my eyes and gently squeezed my arm. I didn't need an explanation. My heart pounded. As soon as she walked away, I waited for the right moment and ran to the barn. There, hidden among the haystacks, I opened the note with trembling hands. The words were written in haste, but they were clear. If you're reading this, it's because you feel the same emptiness I once felt. I escaped the community 2 years ago. I know it's hard to believe, but there's life out there. Freedom, and a God who doesn't punish but welcomes. The women here are silenced, used, and discarded. This is not what God wants for us. If you ever decide to run, look for the old oak tree on the main road. On Fridays at dusk, a supply cart passes by. Don't be afraid. Signed, Miriam. Miriam. I remembered her. Young, brave, gone. They said she had died in an accident in the fields, but now I knew the truth. She had escaped. She was alive. And more importantly, she was saying another life was possible. In that moment, my soul was pierced by a ray of light and doubt at the same time. Everything I believed began to crumble inside me. What if everything we were taught was a lie? What if God wasn't the cruel executioner they preached, but a loving Father waiting for me to free myself from the prison they placed me in? I carefully hid the note between the folds of my Bible. I spent the rest of the day trying to seem normal, but my mind was spinning. I looked at Elias, at the other women, at the elders, and felt disgust. How had I accepted all this for so long without questioning? How had I allowed them to kill my soul and my son with such coldness? That night, I waited until everyone was asleep and knelt on the floor of my room in tears. Lord, I don't know who you are anymore. I don't know what to believe. But if you truly see me, if you truly love me, give me strength. Show me the way. I can't take it anymore. The weeks that followed were filled with tension. I knew I couldn't trust anyone. The community was surrounded by watchful eyes, and the slightest slip could condemn me. I had to be careful, but at the same time the desire for freedom burned inside me like fire. I began discreetly watching the main road. The old oak tree mentioned in the letter was just over 2 kilometers from my house. It seemed so close yet so far. Every step I took was monitored, every outing watched. Elias had become even more rigid after the baby's death. There was no room for mistakes. One Thursday night, hidden in the barn, I began to plan my escape. The letter said that on Fridays at dusk, a supply cart would pass by the oak. I knew I would need courage. More than that, I would need to overcome the fear that had followed me since childhood. But God, in His silence, seemed to be watching me. And that same week, the doubt I carried turned into a calling. On Friday morning, during breakfast, Elias knocked over his cup and, irritated, ordered me to clean it on my knees right in front of him. As I knelt there, wiping the floor with trembling hands, he spat out cruel words. "You are nothing. God put you here to serve me." In that moment, the decision was made. I couldn't live like this anymore. That wasn't life. It wasn't faith. It was a prison. It was torture. That afternoon, I pretended to feel sick so they would let me rest. In the back of my room, I hid a few small items in a bag. A piece of bread, a bit of water, Miriam's letter, and my Bible. Nothing else. I would leave the rest behind, including my fear. As the sun began to set, my heart nearly burst out of my chest. I knew I had only one chance. I waited for Elias to leave for the men's weekly meeting, and with my heart in my throat, I slipped out through the back door. The cold wind cut across my face, but fear made me run without stopping. Every sound from the woods made my heart race. I ran, stumbled, fell, and got back up again. At last I reached the old oak tree. The sky was darkening and I trembled, not just from the cold but from sheer terror. What if someone saw me? What if no one showed up? What if it was a trap? Time passed painfully slowly. I nearly gave up. But then I heard the creaking of wheels. A cart was approaching. My heart stopped for a second. I hid among the trees and waited. The cart rolled by slowly, driven by a man with a simple appearance but kind eyes. I gathered my courage and stepped out. He looked at me, surprised but not afraid. "Are you one of them?" he asked quietly. I just nodded, crying. "Get in. Quickly," he said. At that moment, I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what awaited me. But inside that cart, wrapped in an old blanket and shaking with fear and hope, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: relief. I had taken the first step. And for the first time in my life, I felt like God was carrying me in His arms. I wish I could say that my first attempt at escape was a success, that everything went as I dreamed, and that freedom came gently and miraculously. But the truth is, for someone raised in an invisible prison, leaving it is much harder than simply running down an empty road. Fear is a heavy chain pulling you backward, and the claws of control are sharp and relentless. When that man, the cart driver with kind eyes, dropped me off on a dirt road miles away from the community, I was trembling. He gave me a little water, a piece of bread, and whispered, "You're brave. Follow the path until the end. There's a farm. They help girls like you there." I thanked him through tears. It was pitch dark, the moon hidden behind clouds, and the cold wind lashed against my face. I walked. I don't know for how long. Every step felt like a battle between hope and terror. At any moment, I expected to hear the sound of carts from the community coming after me. I was afraid of the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, of hidden eyes in the dark. When I finally saw distant lights, my heart pounded. I ran, stumbled, got up, and ran again. I reached a wooden fence and called out softly, "Please, someone." An elderly woman came out holding a lantern. She looked at me for a long moment and without asking any questions opened the gate. "Come in, girl. You're safe here." At that moment I collapsed. I cried so much I couldn't speak. She brought me inside, gave me a warm blanket and a strong cup of tea. "You're not the first, dear," she said gently. "And you won't be the last." I spent the night there, warm, welcomed, but still haunted. In the morning she told me that the next day they would take me to a shelter in another town. "You'll be able to start over." But I underestimated the watchful power of the Amish community. And more than anything, I underestimated Elias. On the second day before I could leave, we heard the sound of carts arriving. Terror filled the house. The couple who had taken me and tried to hide me in the barn, but there was no time. "Rebecca Miller." Elias's voice thundered. "Come out now." I froze. He had found me. My heart sank. Wheels creaked outside, and the sound of boots crunching the frozen dirt made me tremble with fear. Elias stormed into the house like a violent wind. His face was red with rage. "Come," he ordered, grabbing my arm forcefully. I begged. "Please, please, don't take me back." But my pleas were useless. He dragged me outside as I cried, screaming in despair. "Why do you run from what God wants for you?" he roared. The return was the worst humiliation I'd ever lived. They tied my hands. The cart moved in silence. The elders looked at me with disdain. The women with pity. I no longer cared what they thought. All I felt was a black hole inside my chest. When we arrived at the community, I was taken straight to the main barn, where punishments were carried out. They threw me to the ground. Elias forced me to kneel and looked into Elder Jacob's eyes. "She dishonored the community." The elder didn't hesitate. "Disobedience must be corrected." They left me there on the cold barn floor alone, without food, without water, for 2 days. I trembled. I had a fever. My tears had dried. On the second night Elias came in. His voice was cold and venomous. "You are nothing without us. Who do you think you are?" I didn't answer. I just closed my eyes. On the third day they took me to the central square in front of everyone. I was dirty, weak, my face pale and my eyes sunken. I was forced to kneel and ask for forgiveness out loud. "Forgive me, community. Forgive me, my husband. Forgive me, God, for having fled and dishonored my role." My voice came out broken, barely a whisper. The elder placed his hand on my head and said, "May this punishment remind you of the place God has chosen for you." I was taken back home. Elias said nothing. But that night, as I lay down on the cold bed, my body aching and my soul shattered, something inside me changed. I was no longer afraid. I had no more tears. I had rage. And deep in my heart I knew I would try again. Because God could not possibly want this for me. I began to plan silently my next step. This time I would not fail. After my failed escape and the public punishment I endured, I spent weeks living like a ghost. My eyes were empty, my soul broken. I did what I was told, cleaned, cooked, obeyed, but I wasn't really there anymore. Inside, something had shifted. I no longer feared punishment because I had already hit rock bottom. Now all that remained was a bitter feeling, the certainty that this was not the true God. I continued praying in silence, but my prayers were no longer filled with pleading. They were cries of anguish, of pain, of heartbreak. I asked God night after night why He allowed such cruelty. Why He let His daughters be trampled, humiliated, treated as worthless servants. It was during that time of inner silence and rebellion that life showed me something even more cruel than my suffering. the truth about my husband. I had always known Elias was a cold, harsh man without compassion. But I had never imagined what was hidden behind that impassive face. One afternoon while I was cleaning the main barn, I overheard whispered voices. I stayed hidden behind a stack of hay, listening unintentionally. I recognized Elias's voice and that of another elder. They spoke in hushed tones, but the words were clear enough to freeze my blood. "The new girl, is she ready?" the elder asked. "Yes. I prepared her myself. She's submissive now," Elias replied coldly. "And her mother?" "Shut your mouth. Don't ask too many questions. We know how to keep order." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My husband, the man who dragged me to my knees to ask for forgiveness, who spoke of God and obedience, was involved in something dark. In the days that followed, I began paying closer attention. I watched as very young girls were taken to the elders' homes under the pretense of special discipline. Some returned different, dimmed eyes, sadness etched into their faces. I knew what it meant even if I didn't want to accept it. One night I couldn't hold it in. I confronted Elias in the kitchen. "What do you do to those girls?" He looked at me like I was a bothersome insect. "Mind your own business, Rebecca. They're children." My voice trembled, but it was firm. He slowly walked toward me, and for the first time I saw hatred in his eyes. "I'm your husband. You have no right to question me. If you open your mouth again, the punishment will be worse than the last." That night I cried silently. I had no more doubts. The elders and my own husband were using the veil of faith to cover up terrible crimes. The following Sunday during service, I saw little Hannah, only 12 years old, sitting in the front row. Her eyes were swollen and she trembled. When I looked at Elias, he gave Elder Jacob a discreet smile. My stomach turned. I felt disgust. Disgust that I was married to that man. Disgust for all those people who called themselves servants of God but hid abuse behind rules. I began writing in secret in an old notebook I found in the back of the closet. I needed to get everything out. I wrote down every detail, every conversation I overheard, every suspicious behavior. It was my only escape, my only way to stay sane. One night I was startled by a whisper at the kitchen door. It was Ruth, the same woman who had given me the note months before. Her eyes were filled with tears. "I know too," she said, barely audible. "What do you know?" I asked, though I already feared the answer. "My husband, he does the same to our daughter." The floor disappeared beneath me. I embraced Ruth and we cried together. For the first time, I understood that I wasn't alone in my pain. There were other women trapped in the same silent hell. The next morning, after Elias left early, I went into his office and searched. I found letters, records, an organized network of abuse, hidden beneath papers with Bible verses twisted to justify their actions. I trembled with fear and disgust. But more than anything, I felt a revolt growing inside me like a volcano ready to erupt. That night I looked him in the eyes again. "I know everything, Elias. I know what you've done." He slapped me so hard I fell to the ground. "You'll regret saying that," he hissed. I got up slowly, wiped the blood from the corner of my mouth and stared into his eyes. "No. One day you're the one who'll regret it." From that moment on, my fear vanished. I was no longer that submissive girl. I was a wounded woman, but determined. And I knew I had to escape again. Not just for myself, but for all those girls. I began to plan everything in silence. And this time I knew that if I failed, there would be no turning back. I had to get out. I had to report it. I had to destroy that perverse structure. God did not want this. And I felt that He was finally giving me the strength to fight. After discovering what was truly happening in the shadows of that community, the abuse, the silence, the lies, I knew there was no more room for hesitation. The pain and fear that had followed me since childhood had given way to something new. A sense of mission. It was no longer just about me. No longer only about my freedom. It was about all those girls being silenced, manipulated, and used as objects by men hiding behind religion. I spent sleepless nights, my heart tight, planning every step. I knew that this time I couldn't fail. A second failed attempt wouldn't just bring physical punishment, it could cost me my life. Elias had already shown who he really was: cold, violent, ruthless. And if he discovered I was planning another escape, I doubted he'd have any mercy. Winter had come. The nights were long, cold, silent. And it was on one of those freezing nights that I finally saw the opportunity. The community would, from time to time, receive deliveries of supplies from city suppliers. One of those carts would pass on a Friday night. And I remembered Miriam's note, the road by the old oak tree, the silent warning that now felt like it had been written especially for me. I just needed to get there. The problem was that Elias now watched me like a hawk. Every step I took he was watching. Every trip to the well or the chicken coop was followed by suspicious questions. Even so, God showed me small openings. I started hiding supplies. A piece of bread, a canteen of water, some cloths. I set aside a lighter dress that wouldn't make noise as I walked and hid everything under loose boards in the barn floor. During the day I pretended to be resigned. At night I prayed in silence, asking for strength. When Friday came, anxiety consumed me. Elias left early for a meeting with other men from the community. I knew I had only a few hours. The bitter cold that night felt like a warning of danger. My feet trembled, my stomach was in knots. I put on the simplest dress I had, grabbed the hidden bag and slipped out through the side door of the barn. The community was asleep. The silence was absolute, interrupted only by the cutting wind. I walked quickly but carefully. The path to the old oak seemed endless. Every crack beneath my feet made my heart race. I kept imagining Elias appearing at any moment. I reached the oak tree minutes before the expected time. The cold cut through my bones, but I didn't care. My body trembled, but my mind was firm. And then, finally, I heard the sound of wheels. The cart appeared on the empty road, led by a man with a tired face but kind eyes. When he saw me step out from behind the tree, his eyes widened, but he said nothing. He simply held out his hand. "Get in. Quickly." I jumped into the cart, hid under the blanket, and as the wheels creaked along the road, tears streamed down my face. For the first time I was leaving that prison behind. The journey was long. The cart rocked and I fought to hold back my fear. At any moment I imagined Elias appearing, filled with rage and violence. But the road remained calm. At dawn the man stopped at a distant farm. "Here," he said, helping me down. "They'll take care of you." I thanked him with tears in my eyes. He smiled gently. "God brought you here. Don't be afraid." I was welcomed by a woman named Margaret. She hugged me tightly, like a mother embracing a long-lost daughter. "You're safe now. Here you are free." I broke down in her arms. In the days that followed, Margaret helped me understand the world outside the Amish bubble. She showed me normal clothes, taught me how to use simple devices, explained that yes, God is love, not punishment. But peace didn't last long. 2 days later, while I was helping clean the barn on the farm, we heard the sound of wagons on the road. Margaret came running. "They found out. After you." My body froze. "What do I do?" I asked, panicked. "Go to the back. There's a delivery truck heading to the city. They'll take you to a shelter. Hurry." I ran, my heart racing, tears in my eyes. I climbed into the back of the truck. The driver, a young man named Andrew, looked at me confused. Margaret came up and whispered something in his ear. He nodded. "Hold on. We're leaving right now." The wagons were getting closer on the dirt road, but the truck pulled away before they could see us. My heart only began to slow once the open road was behind us. We arrived in the city at dusk. Andrew dropped me off in front of a small building with a sign, "Christian Women's Shelter." I went inside. I was welcomed by a woman named Clara who hugged me tightly. "You're safe here. You don't have to be afraid anymore." That night, I slept in a warm bed without fear of being woken by shouting or commands. For the first time, I heard soft worship songs coming from the hallway. and I understood what true faith was. I had escaped. I had survived. But deep inside I knew my story didn't end there. I had seen too much. I knew of horrors that had to be exposed. And above all, I felt God's calling whispering, "You didn't escape just for yourself. You escaped to set others free." That night, I knelt beside the bed, closed my eyes and said, "Lord, use my life. I will speak. I will expose. And I will fight for all those who are still trapped." And I knew I would never be silenced again. I thought that by escaping the Amish community, the nightmare would be over. I thought it would be enough to leave, to put physical distance between me and that oppressive world, and everything would be fine. But the exile of the soul doesn't end when the body escapes. I carried a battlefield within me, a constant voice questioning whether I truly deserved to be free, whether God approved of my decision, or if I was doomed to hell for disobeying sacred orders. The Christian shelter that took me in was simple but full of love. Clara, the woman who welcomed me at the door, quickly became a second mother to me. She had the patience to hear my silences, to respect my pace, and little by little she began to introduce me to a God I had never known. A God of mercy, of kindness, of forgiveness, not the executioner I had been taught to fear since childhood. In the first days I couldn't talk much. I cried a lot, slept little, and had constant nightmares. I dreamed of Elias dragging me back, of elders forcing me to beg for forgiveness in front of everyone, of Hannah's face, that sad-eyed girl I couldn't save. Clara saw that I needed more than comfort. She took me to a Christian therapist named Maria who changed my life. In the first session I sat across from her with a closed heart. She smiled and said, "Rebecca, you're not here to be judged. You're here to be heard." Those words disarmed me. I broke down. For hours I told her everything. The punishments, the humiliations, the forced marriage, the baby I lost, the first escape attempt, the barn imprisonment, the abuse covered up by the leadership, and finally my miraculous escape. Maria listened in silence, tears rolling down her cheeks too. When I finished, she held my hands and said, "That wasn't God. That was man manipulating the name of God. The true God cried with you through every one of those nights. He never wanted your suffering." It was the first time in my life I heard someone say that. I wasn't cursed. I wasn't rebellious. I was a victim of a corrupted system. From that day on, I began a slow and painful process of rebuilding. I still woke up scared, expecting shouting and orders. For weeks, I was afraid to open the door and find Elias there ready to drag me back. The sound of wagon wheels in the street made me freeze. The shadow of a tall man made me instinctively back away. But little by little I started to understand that the world was bigger than that community. That people outside of it didn't live under the yoke of guilt and fear. Clara introduced me to a small group of women, many of them also ex-Amish. When I sat for the first time in a circle with others who carried stories similar to mine, I felt I wasn't alone anymore. Each one shared their own Calvary. Arranged marriages, loss of children, abuse disguised as discipline, and the constant fear of the sin we were never able to escape. We cried together, but we also began to laugh together. Shy, soft laughter, like someone discovering for the first time that life could be light. As the weeks passed, I began helping at the shelter. I washed dishes, helped care for the children who came with their mothers, organized donated clothes. Small gestures that showed me I could be useful in another way, not as a submissive servant but as someone who chose to help. On Sundays I went to an evangelical church for the first time. Fear almost paralyzed me at the door. I was trembling. What if God punished me right there for entering a modern temple? But what I found brought me to tears. Joyful music, people lifting their hands, prayers spoken from the heart, words of love and welcome. There were no threats, no terror. The pastor spoke of a God who heals, who embraces, who understands our flaws and invites us to begin again. I wept uncontrollably, sitting in the last row, feeling for the first time in my life what spiritual freedom truly was. The nightmares began to fade, but in their place came panic attacks. Sometimes, while cleaning the shelter's dining hall, I'd suddenly feel my heart race, my breathing stop, my hands go cold and sweaty, as if I were back in the community square, kneeling in front of everyone. Maria helped me deal with it. "Don't fight those memories, Rebecca," she would say. "Face them and tell yourself, I survived this. It no longer has power over me." I repeated that like a mantra. Over time, I decided that healing wasn't enough. I needed to turn my pain into a voice. I asked Claire and Maria for help, and we began recording short videos, secretly telling my story without showing my face. Short testimonies, posted quietly on discreet platforms, warning about what happens inside certain closed religious communities. And the responses started coming in. Other women sent anonymous messages. "I'm trapped too. I don't know how to get out. I thought God hated me. Now I see I was deceived. How did you find the courage? I dream of doing the same." Each message made me cry, but they also made me stronger. I knew I was on the right path. One day Maria asked me, "Rebecca, what do you want for the future?" I paused for a moment and answered with tears in my eyes, "I want no girl to go through what I went through. I want them to know that God is not the monster we were taught. I want to help them escape. I want to build a bridge between fear and freedom." She smiled. "Then that's exactly what we're going to do." And that's how the project was born. A confidential support group to help women escape abusive communities, offering them shelter, safety, and a chance to start over. With every story I heard, I felt the weight of responsibility. But with it came a peace I had never known before. The certainty that I was finally living the purpose God had given me. I was no longer a prisoner. I was now part of God's plan to set others free. Getting here wasn't easy. I thought that by fleeing the community the worst was behind me. But in truth, that was only the beginning of a new battle. A battle to find my voice, to heal my wounds, to turn pain into action. Today, sitting in front of this paper, I no longer write as the Amish girl who cried in silence. I write as a free woman, as a beloved daughter of a God who doesn't want me in chains, but lifted up. When we started the support group, I had no idea how big it would become. At first, it was just a few women, all too afraid to show their faces, hiding behind false names and trembling voices. Some still carried the guilt, that same guilt I knew so well. The belief that disobeying the community leadership was the same as disobeying God. But little by little, I watched each of them come back to life. I saw myself in every one of those women, victims of a system that distorted scripture, manipulated faith, and turned obedience into a prison. The first story I heard was from Sarah, a young girl just 16 years old who had escaped a community in Indiana. She arrived at the shelter weak, bruised, shaking with fear. She sat across from me, lowered her head and said, "I'm not worthy. I'm dirty." I took her hands, looked into her eyes and answered, "No. You are a daughter of God. You are loved. You are worthy. You are strong." She cried and I cried with her. With every woman who arrived, I remembered the calling God had placed on my heart. To free other women, to expose what so many refused to see. Eventually, I knew I could no longer hide my story. I needed to show my face, my voice, my name. It didn't matter how afraid I was. It didn't matter the risks. That day, I sat in front of the camera with a tight heart. Claire held my hand. Maria stood beside me, praying. I took a deep breath and began. "My name is Rebecca Miller. I was born and raised in an Amish community. Today, I'm here to tell what happens to women inside." My words were honest, painful, but liberating. I told everything. The forced marriage, the public punishments, the unattended childbirth, the death of my baby, the escape attempts, the barn imprisonment, the discovery of the abuse, the miraculous escape, and the long, painful process of rebuilding. The video was published. I knew my life would change forever. In the days that followed, I received thousands of messages. Some were supportive, others filled with hate. Members of the Amish community tried to discredit my story. They called me a liar, a rebel, cursed. They said I was condemned. But other messages came from women who for the first time saw a way out. I thought I was alone. Now I see there's hope. You said everything I never had the courage to say. Please help me get out. Each one of those messages gave me strength. But the hardest part was still ahead. I needed to formally report the crimes I had uncovered. With the help of lawyers and the police, I handed over the evidence I had kept. The letters, the records I found in Elias's office, and the testimonies I had collected from other women. The process was long, painful, and full of threats. I received anonymous phone calls saying I would pay dearly for exposing the community. But I didn't back down. Months later, the operation took place. Elders were arrested. Homes were investigated. Girls were rescued. Hannah, that sad-eyed girl I had never forgotten, was one of them. When I saw her again far from the community, I ran to her and hugged her. She cried in my arms and said, "I thought I'd never see you again." In that moment I knew it was all worth it. The shelter grew. Today we're a network of support helping women from various closed communities find freedom. And I found peace. My faith now is different. It's no longer based on fear but on the certainty that God is love. I met a good man, truly God-fearing, who respects and supports me. This time marriage wasn't a prison, it was a choice. I married Andrew, the truck driver who helped me escape. He saw me at my most fragile but always looked at me with respect and kindness. We fell in love slowly with patience and freedom. And today we walk together side by side helping other women start over. When I look back, I see that little girl kneeling in the square, crying from shame, and I wish I could hug her and say, "One day you'll be free. One day you'll help others find freedom too." And I found peace. My faith now is different. It's no longer based on fear but on the certainty that God is love. I met a good man, truly God-fearing, who respects and supports me. This time marriage wasn't a prison, it was a choice. I married Andrew, the truck driver who helped me escape. He saw me at my most fragile but always looked at me with respect and kindness. We fell in love slowly with patience and freedom. And today we walk together side by side helping other women start over. When I look back, I see that little girl kneeling in the square, crying from shame, and I wish I could hug her and say, "One day you'll be free. One day you'll help others find freedom too." Today I write this testimony for you, you who may be reading these words and still trapped in silence. For you who believe God has abandoned you, that there is no way out, that you deserve the punishment you endure. I'm here to tell you, no. That is not God. That is a lie. The true God does not punish with violence, does not humiliate, does not imprison. The true God calls you out of the prison, lifts you up, embraces you, and says, "You are my beloved daughter." If you are reading this and your heart feels tight, know this. There is a way. There is freedom. There is life beyond fear. I was silenced for many years. Today I am a voice. I was a prisoner. Today I am free. And if you want, you can be too. May my story serve as a lighthouse in the dark. May you find courage, strength, and true faith. And may you one day tell your own story. Because every chain can be broken. And every wounded soul can be healed. I am Rebecca Miller. And I'm here to say, God is love. And freedom is the gift He has for you.